your assets, your wealth, your house, all the money in your bank, etc., could end up being inherited by someone you don't even know about. Welcome to the Wealth Conversation. This is the podcast that takes intimidating money talk and transforms it into empowering financial discussions. If you are new to this podcast, welcome. It's so great to have you here. And to my loyal subscribers and followers, thank you so much for your continued support. It really means a lot to me. Now, as usual, I am going to encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. It really helps this podcast to be found by other people. And also, you'll get notified when a new episode is dropped. For today's episode, I want to talk about wills. Now, a will is something that I believe we all know about, or we should know about them. If you are deemed an adult, you should definitely be considering having a will in place. The other thing I know about wills is that they cause a lot of commotion in all communities. It just depends on the particular household and individual in question or individuals. There are many reasons why, but I believe that the main reason is when we talk about our wills or putting a will in place, it makes us think about that one thing that we all know is coming, but are afraid to face and talk about. And that is our own death, that point in time when we're no longer on this earth. And it's quite an emotional thing to think about. It's also a very emotional time for people. People are generally sad when someone passes away, but it is something that is coming, and I believe that we should prepare for it. As you know, I am the champion of expecting the unexpected. And actually, death is not something that is unexpected. What is unexpected is the time of it. Now, a will is something that helps you decide what is going to happen to your possessions, to your money, to your property, and also if you've got young children, who or how your children should be looked after until they become adults. And I think that's one point that a lot of parents, a lot of adults don't consider. And also it's a way of ensuring that your wishes are followed because it's written down and there can be some legal recourse if things aren't done the way you've laid out in your will. So keep that in mind, especially if you are thinking of starting a family or if you have young children. The other thing to consider about a will is that it can make sure that you don't pay a lot of tax or more tax than you should do. And when I talk about tax, I mean inheritance tax. So this is the tax that will be levied by the government on your total assets at the date when you pass away. I am based in the United Kingdom, so the rules might be slightly different where you are, but generally when it comes to a will, it is a good way and potentially one of the simplest ways of protecting all the assets you've built up over time, all the wealth that you've built up over time. And also it allows you to name the people who you want to inherit. If you die and you don't have a will in place, here in the UK, there is a law that comes into place, which is called the law of intestacy. And this is when the government will look at your assets and look at your family lineage. So who you've left behind from spouse, children, grandchildren, siblings, aunts, uncles, and they will start dividing your assets amongst those people in a particular order. I am not going to go into the law of intestacy because it can get very complicated and it's dependent on your circumstances at the time of your death. If you want to know more about that and you're based in the UK, then I urge you to go onto the gov.uk website and type in intestacy. A lot of information will come up on there. What I will say about that law of intestacy is your assets, your wealth, your house, all the money in your bank, etc., could end up being inherited by someone you don't even know about. someone you really didn't like, someone who you would have never passed on your assets to, and they would benefit from your hard work. So it's really important, I believe, to have a will in place. Now, in terms of when to set up a will, I would say as soon as you're deemed an adult, it's a good idea to start thinking about a will. And some people will say, well, I don't own much, but actually over time you could start accumulating wealth. And, for a lot of us, our main asset that we want to acquire is a property. And so it would be good to start thinking about, if I got a property and I passed away for whatever reason, who would I want that asset to pass on to? For younger people, I would definitely say think about a will, especially if you're someone who is going into business. It's not uncommon for young people to start businesses and they become successful really quickly. So think about, how can you protect your wealth in the simplest way? A will is a good way of doing that. Some people set up wills not to pass on their assets to family members or friends, but actually to pass on to charity. And that is a fantastic way of managing inheritance tax here in the United Kingdom, but also a great way to give back to maybe organizations that have helped you and your family in the past. I will touch on some of the reasons why you should have a will in place, which are not about being practical about who's going to inherit, etc. One of the main reasons, or one of the things that I've found that wills help with, is just giving clarity to the people you've left behind, right? So at a time when maybe they have lost someone who is really key in their lives, or even if you weren't a key person in their life, but someone who was a part of their lives, people's emotions are quite heightened. And some people may feel that they knew you better than everybody else on the planet. And, just having that will in place, which it's in black and white and it's very clear about how you want your assets to be distributed, those who are dependent on you to be looked after, is really important, and it just simplifies things for everyone. We've all watched a movie where someone dies suddenly and a will is read out and people are shocked at how that individual has distributed their assets. That is definitely not uncommon. It's not unique to the movies. It happens a lot in real life. And yes, some people may be upset. Some people may be confused, but the one thing they will have is clarity, and it will be written in black and white. The worst thing you can do is, if you have a big family and you don't have a will in place, you don't write things down, you are not clear, you don't give people clarity on how you want your wealth to be distributed. That is when we see the infighting, we see relationships breaking down to the point where people will no longer talk to each other for years. And, that one thing, the failure to put that will in place, could actually cause a rift in your family for a very, very long time. Those are a couple of reasons why it is important to have a will in place, in my opinion. There are no legal requirements, as far as I know, to have a will in place, right? So it really is a choice. And the choice you're making is really about whether you want to protect the wealth that you've created, whether you want to ensure that your family is protected and looked after, and there are no questions, no anyone who would want to come and take anything away from them would have to deal with the letter of the law, because in your will you have given your assets or certain property to your family, whether that's a surviving spouse, whether that's children, whether that's grandchildren. A will is also a great starting point for the generational wealth transfer. in a will, you can actually set up a trust after you've passed away, which can then ring fence money, property, some of your possessions for several generations. And so it's one way of ensuring that generational wealth transfer whilst protecting your assets for the next generation. There are challenges, though, in setting up a will, and I don't want to make it seem like, it's you just go and you sit down and come up with a list of people who you want to pass on your assets to. Common challenges that I have come across and heard about are, first of all, part of setting up the will is choosing executors. Now, an executor is someone who you appoint to ensure that your final wishes are respected and carried through. And your executor should be someone who you know quite well, or who knows you well, or a professional like a solicitor. So they may not know you, but they have the authority to ensure that your wishes and your will are followed to the T. So that is the first challenge, choosing the right people to be your executors. And it could be that you choose people who you think are right. They might pass away before you. And, in a case of if you're older than the people you've chosen, it's not uncommon for younger people to pass away before an older person. So sometimes it's worth considering having more than one executor, but also as part of having a will, it is recommended that you review your will every 5 years. And by reviewing, it doesn't mean rewriting the will. It's just checking that it matches what you put in your will initially, matches your circumstances now. So that in itself can be a challenge, reviewing a will. I talk with a lot of clients and I ask them at review time for the work that we do together, whether they've checked their will, reviewed their will, and most of the time it's no. Because it is a bit of a process in terms of you need to find the time to sit down, go through the will again and compare it to what your assets are. And a lot of people just don't set aside that time. So other challenges that I have come across is, how do you divide your assets, especially if you are in a situation where you are in what is known as a blended family. With a blended family, you're essentially having different groups of people coming together at different times. And these comings together happen at different stages of the wealth creation journey. Some groups might feel that they deserve more from your estate than others should get, and it becomes a problem. There is something called transferring of wealth down the bloodline. And so, for example, if I have children and I remarry and my husband brings with him his children, I may want to, in my will, to make sure that my assets in my name go to my children and not his children from another relationship, even though I view those children as my stepchildren. At the same time, we're all, say, living under one roof, and me and my husband or partner are working together, moving forward to continue building wealth for ourselves and our children who we are all looking after. So there can be scenarios where it is a bit difficult, especially in that situation, to decide who gets what and at what percentage. So it does need you to take some time to consider these scenarios. I should say at this stage, if you have put a will in place when you are single, once you get married, your will is no longer valid. So you will need to do another will, because marriage creates certain, there are certain laws that come into place when you get married. For example, how you can transfer assets from one spouse to the other or a partner. So it's really important, if you're deciding to go down the marriage route and you have a will in place already, to seek advice and actually also just understand that you will need to get your will redone, because your will that you wrote up when you were single or not married is now invalid. Some of the misconceptions around wills are if you put a will in place, you're going to die. No, you're not going to die. If anything, putting a will in place for a lot of people releases a lot of pressure, strain, and worry. It's actually quite amazing. And I can say that with all honesty, because that's how I felt when I put my will in place. Suddenly I had a plan. And it was difficult thinking through how my assets were going to be divided, especially because I'm also in a blended family, but also because I thought to myself, well, I don't have much really. My husband and I just bought our family home, and that's the only major asset. But actually, after putting it in place, I sort of felt that, I can now go ahead, create wealth, as much wealth as I can, and know who will end up inheriting it. I also know that it will be protected. I've also got a plan which could be changed at any time. That for me was a great end at weight and relief for me. Another misconception is that once you've done your will, that's it. And actually, no, it's not. You're encouraged to review your will every 5 years because things happen, life changes, people get divorced, people get married. It is very important, especially in the UK, because there are certain rules that apply to married couples or people who are cohabitating or in particular relationships. So it's important to ensure that as you're entering a relationship with someone where there's either going to be a marriage or cohabitation, you understand what impact it will have on your will prior to getting into the relationship, and then ensuring that you get your will rewritten to reflect the change. I'm going to talk a little bit about when things go wrong with wills and when there are disputes. And most of the time, it's because there hasn't been the right level of communication. And the scenarios I'm going to talk about here are when there is a will in place, because when there isn't a will in place, it can be quite contentious, right? Because everyone thinks they know what your final wishes are. But say your will is in place, you are no longer on this earth. I mentioned the blended family scenario. So some children, or maybe if you've married several times, may feel that they're entitled to more than they have been given through your will. And it's possible that they may contest the will. And that might mean going to the courts about it. And you normally hear of the high profile cases where sometimes what's in the will has been overturned. But I believe in most cases things will stand. But it really depends on the situation and the case. I did an episode on power of attorneys. Like a power of attorney as well, you should make sure your will is written and signed when you are deemed to still be of sound mind. We've seen high profile cases where people's wills have been written maybe a few days or a week or so before they passed away. And it could be questionable whether they were of sound mind. And this is where also sometimes the wills get contested by family members. Another complication that might come up or disputes is where there is a will in place, but the best friend or someone else or a business partner would have had a conversation with you or the person who's passed away, and things would have been said which are different to what is written in the will. More often than not, this is probably because the will hasn't been reviewed on a regular basis or updated. So a will that was written 20 years ago will be seen as a legally binding document because it was written, signed, etc., and you were of sound mind. Your relationships may have changed within that 20-year period, but because you haven't updated your will, it's possible that the wrong people end up inheriting or the wrong structures are set up. Also, some of the other problems that come up when wills are not reviewed is certain assets get missed out. So suddenly, you may have, say, for example, you've started a business and you've accumulated, whether it's properties elsewhere in different jurisdictions, they're not included in the will, and that can cause issues as well, even including the amount of tax you have to pay, etc. So review as often as you can. And if your circumstances change, just double check that your will is fit for purpose. It could be that your will has been done in such a way that it can address multiple changes in your life, which is great. But it's always good to check, even if that is the case, because there could be that one thing that gets missed out simply because we didn't have time or we weren't disciplined enough to review our wills. So I know I've talked quite a bit about the good, the bad, the ugly, the positive of wills. And I think it's really important that we all seek some advice on what a will would look like for us as individuals. And to do this, I would encourage you to speak to a solicitor or a will writer. I'm sure these days the internet is amazing. If you just go into Google and search for a solicitor or a will writer, you'll find someone who you can talk through some of the aspects of your circumstances, and they could give you guidance on the best way to set up your will. There are different costs for putting together a will depending on who you go to set up the will for you and how complicated your situation is. So just bear that in mind. Here in the UK, there are quite a few charities that offer will writing services. I know that they target older people, but it's worth kind of looking them up and also reading some of the documents that they have. Age UK is one that offers will writing services, so it's worth kind of going onto their website and getting to understand some of the steps to writing a will, even if you don't use them. But I think it's a good resource. Again, gov.uk, fantastic resources and information on the importance of a will, how a will works, and some of the tax benefits you could get depending on where you live if you have a will in place. In my opinion, having a will is a good thing. It is a very important thing to have. It protects you in several ways, as I've mentioned before, including helping to make sure that you do not pay more inheritance tax than you need to. When I have conversations about wills, I'm also asked about trusts. And for the majority of people I speak to, there's no need to set up a trust before you die. Actually, you can write a trust into your will and it gets set up after you've passed away. It tends to be a bit cheaper. If that is something you're interested in doing, then definitely speak to a professional, speak to a solicitor about how you can incorporate a trust into your will. With setting up a trust, you would also have to appoint trustees. I would say the main thing to remember also about a will is you have to choose an executor or executors. These are the people who will ensure that your final wishes are followed and carried out. So make sure these are people who have the time and the capacity to do this on your behalf. I think if you are a parent, the most important thing that a will do for you is ensure that your children are looked after the way you would have wanted them to be looked after. It makes it clear to family members and friends who you would want to look after your children. And on that note, I would like to say that if you feel that you would like someone to look after your children, should you pass away and they're still minors, talk to that person first before putting their name in your will, because it is a huge responsibility. You know, I'm big on communication and just talking and making sure that the individual is aware that these are your wishes and that they understand exactly what it means. Because some things are difficult putting down on paper is very important. You also don't want your children to be left with someone who ends up resenting having to look after them because you didn't have the conversations with them to take on this responsibility. But ultimately, a will is a way of just relieving that pressure and stress of uncertainty. It is a great way of protecting your assets and your family should the unexpected happen. And it's also just a way of showing your family that you were thinking about them all this time, that they are important to you. And it's also a way of ensuring that you leave a lasting legacy for your family and your community. And so I would encourage anyone listening to this podcast who doesn't already have a will in place to start thinking about it and taking action to start the will writing process. If you do have a will, but there are people around you who don't have wills, then let's have those conversations with family, friends, and our parents as well. Let's start talking to our parents about putting their wills in place. And maybe you can start putting your will in place together with your parents. I hope that you have found this episode informative and that it has transformed the way you look at wills. I hope that it has triggered something in you to either have a conversation with those close to you about wills, and also given you a bit more direction on where to go should you need to put a will in place. I'd love to know in the comment section, what did you think about wills before listening to this episode? And what are your thoughts now after listening to this episode? Are you going to share this episode with family and friends and continue the discussion about wills? Let me know. In the meantime, if you have got any other topics that you'd like me to discuss or bring a guest onto the podcast to discuss, then do let me know. Either send me a DM on social media at thewealthconversation.com, or send your suggestions by email at info@thewealthconversation.com. Until next time, stay wealthy in mind and spirit.